Okay, this is going to be the last lecture for Unit 1. This is Lecture 3, and we're going to be covering experimental research. And I'm going to say this over and over again throughout the semester, but this time it is absolutely true. Today's lecture is extremely important. Every study that we look at from here on out is going to be using this lecture, so it's really important that you understand experimental research. Before we get into the bits and pieces of how psychologists conduct experimental research, we need to talk about the ethics in experimental research. There are a lot of psychology studies that are extremely controversial, and around the 1960s, the APA, which is the American Psychological Association, came about, and it started to set rules for researchers who were doing experiments. One of the first things that a researcher has to do in psychological experiments is to debrief the patient. A lot of times psychologists that are researchers deceive participants in some way. We lie to people. We might bring in a set of students and tell them, we're going to study your ability to memorize letters and numbers. But in reality, maybe what we're studying is whether or not they conform, whether or not they do what a larger group is doing. That's lying, that's deceiving. So after the study is over, we would need to sit those individuals down and explain to them that we deceived them, that we lied to them. That's the debriefing process. Has to happen in any study where deception is used. A lot of the studies in psychology are controversial. They may involve lying to people like we just said. There's one study in which participants thought they were administering electric shocks to other individuals. In reality, they weren't. There's one study where individuals were locked up in a prison and given either the role of a prison guard or a prison inmate. All of these things are very controversial, so we need to get our studies approved by the APA before we can go forward. You also have to make sure that people have informed consent. Before you start doing testing on them or put them in an experiment, you need to sit down with them and say, look, here are the rules, this is what we're doing. We need you to sign this piece of paper saying that you're cool with it, and if at any time during the study you feel uncomfortable or you want to drop out, you can do so. You have to inform them and you have to get their consent. You have to make them sign something they say that they know what they're getting into. And then, of course, there's a lot of studies that are done on animals in psychology versus people. We need to make sure that we are doing no harm to individuals or animals, either psychologically or physically, through our experimentation. Now remember, in the last lecture we talked about descriptive research, and we said that correlational studies, going back to caffeine and grades, cannot produce a cause and effect relationship. The only research method that can be used to determine cause and effect is experimental research. This is often called the experimental method. This is when we as researchers systematically manipulate a variable under controlled conditions. So we actually set up a lab, we bring in participants to that lab, and we're manipulating a variable within the study in order to see if we can get the outcome that we believe to be true in our hypothesis. Now let me tell you a little bit about one of the psychological studies we're going to be looking at later on in this semester. This is Albert Bandura's Bobo doll study. Albert Bandura was a psychologist who was interested in children. He was a developmental psychologist, and he had this idea. He wanted to look at how the behavior of an adult would affect the behavior of a child. This is what we call intimidating. Not intimidating, I always say that. This is called imitating. So he wanted to see that if children saw an adult doing something, would they do the same thing later on? So what he did is he used children, and one group of children watched an adult play with what he called the Bobo doll. This is a blow-up toy that has sand in the bottom. When you knock it over, it falls over and it pops right back up. So one of these groups of children watched an adult play with the Bobo doll in a violent manner, as you see the woman doing in the top 3 pictures. The adult sat on the Bobo doll, was punching it, kicking it. They'd throw it up in the air. There were other toys in this room, and the adult would pick up a rubber or wooden mallet and hit the Bobo doll and say, sock him in the nose, beat him down, get him. Later on, those same children who watched the adult play violently with the Bobo doll got an opportunity to go into the same room they had watched the adult play with the toy in. All of the children who saw the adult act violently with the Bobo doll did the exact same thing. They sat on him, they threw him up in the air, they used a wooden mallet to knock him over, and this was true for both females and males. So as we talk about the different parts of an experiment, we're going to be going through the Bobo doll study. All right, so what makes an experiment? What are the components of an experiment? Well, the first thing that you have to have are participants. You have to have subjects. You have to have people who are willing to come in and be a part of your research study. And again, you have to give them informed consent. Second part are the variables. These are the factors that you as the researcher are studying. Again, we need to make sure that we operationally define our variables. It's important that we do this so that other researchers can come behind us and recreate our study. The independent variable in a study is what you, the researcher, are manipulating. What are you doing to the experiment to make there be two different outcomes for the different groups of individuals? And then you have the dependent variable. This is the variable that is measured by the experimenter. It is extremely important that if I give you a study, that you be able to pick out the independent versus the dependent variable. So let's go through the Bobo doll study really quickly. The participants are the subjects in the Bobo doll study were 33 boys and 33 girls ranging in age from 41 to 72 months. They were all enrolled at the Stanford University Nursery School. He had 2 male models, adults, playing with the Bobo doll and 1 female model playing with the Bobo doll. Those are his participants. The variables and operational definitions we'll get to in a second. The independent variable, the variable that Bandura was manipulating, was whether or not the children saw the model being violent with the doll or being normal, being peaceful with the Bobo doll. That is what he manipulated. He had 2 different groups. 11 of the boys went and saw the violent adult. 11 of the boys went and saw the adult playing peacefully. Same thing with the girls. That is the variable that he manipulated. The dependent variable, or what it is that Bandura was trying to measure, was the behavior of the children. He wanted to see if the children were doing what the adults had done. The dependent variable depends on the independent variable. If you get confused with the independent versus the dependent variable, it might help if you make an if-then statement. So a good way to identify the independent variable from the dependent variable is make an if-then statement. Whatever follows the if is the independent variable. Whatever follows the then is the dependent variable. So take Bandura's study again. Let's say you're having trouble with the independent versus dependent. A good way to do this is to make a statement. If young children see adults behaving violently with the Bobo doll, then the children will imitate the adult's behavior. What follows the if is the independent variable, whether or not the children saw the adults playing violently. Whatever follows the then is the dependent variable. The dependent variable is the children's behavior. Other parts of an experiment, you've got confounding variables. Now, confounding variables are variables that can mess up your data. They can skew your results in some way. Confounding variables are things that can happen that affect your results other than the independent variable. The experimenter bias is when maybe the experimenter has expectations for the experiment that would influence his data. You do not want there to be confounding variables in your research. You do not want there to be experimenter bias in your research, because that is going to make your study a bad study. It's going to make your study unreliable or potentially not valid. So go back to the Bobo doll study. Confounding variables. What could mess up Bandura's data in his study? Well, if you go back and look at his subjects, his participants, they were all enrolled at the Stanford University Nursery School. We might assume that any child enrolled in this nursery school at Stanford University probably has a parent that is working at Stanford University. Those parents probably tend to be well educated. Maybe they're going to be the ones that are teaching their children that they shouldn't behave violently with toys or others in general. The other thing that could be a confounding variable in Bandura's study is the fact that there are some children that are way more violent than others. So how do we account for that? How do we make sure that that doesn't mess up our data? Maybe you have a little boy or a little girl watching an adult who's playing peacefully with the Bobo doll, but they tend to be more aggressive in their personality in general. So when they go into the room, the first thing they do is see something that, when it falls down, pops back up. They might behave violently. In Bandura's study, the experimenter bias, he actually controlled for this. Good researchers control for biases. And what Bandura did is he had different people rate the children's behavior as being violent, aggressive, or non-violent and non-aggressive. And in having more than one experimenter rate the child's behavior, they were able to compare their results and come to an agreement as to whether or not they believed the child was behaving aggressively or not. Two other components of an experiment are the experimental group and the control group. The experimental group is the group that receives the treatment or has the dependent variable changed. In Bandura's study, the experimental group would be the children who viewed the adult playing violently with the doll. The control group does not receive the treatment or the dependent variable or independent variable. The control group in Bandura's study are the group of children who watched the adult playing peacefully with the doll. So he divided them up into two groups. They were randomly assigned 11 boys, 11 girls to the experimental group with the violent adult, with the Bobo doll, 11 boys, 11 girls with the control group. Those people, those children just watched the adult playing normally with the doll. So these are all extremely important parts of an experiment, of experimental research. And those 9 things you should make sure that you know like the back of your hand.